Hi everyone, welcome to this very sweet discussion on doing sociology. Today we have Ishita Dey with us, and we are going to talk about her book, A Discussion on Sweet Access, Crafting Mishti in Bengal. So those who are hungry can actually go and buy the Mishti already. Let me very quickly introduce Ishita to you. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology, Faculty of Social Sciences, South Asian University, New Delhi. Her research interests lay in migration, labor, food, and census. She has several accomplishments to her name, and an art research project which she co anchored on Smells of the City, focusing on Delhi, is one of them, which was supported by the Kiran Nada Museum of Art, Delhi. She has co edited the book Sustainability of Rights After Globalization, SAGE 2011, and co authored Beyond Kolkata, The Dystopia of Urban Imagination, Routledge 2013. She has been working on the life of sweets and sweetness in South Asia, and her recent book, Sweet Access Crafting Mishti in Bengal, published by Routledge in 2025, is a product of her decade long work on sweets. So, Ishita, very warm welcome to Doing Sociology, and thank you for giving us the time.
Thank you so much, Ritparna. And I think I'm very happy that doing sociology as a platform has agreed to showcase the book.
Right. So let me get straight to the point and ask you what inspired you to focus your ethnographic work on Mishti, a single food substance, for more than a decade?
It started off. It started off by when Michael Crondell was visiting Calcutta for his book, which is titled, "Sweet Invention: A History of Desserts." He got in touch with me, and I was showing him around. And as luck would have it, I kept on telling him that a lot of details around the confectioner caste, the politics of sweet making, and why is it that in Bangla that we have a collapse of the semantic term between the confectioner and the confectioner caste, that is the Moira. And I remember Michael when he left, and he left me a note saying that, this is a great sociological project. And I hope at that point I was thinking of doing my research on something else related to food. And it was a little nudge from Michael Crondell. And when I was helping him out and I was directing him to these various sweet shops, etc., I really thought there's a great potential to write about sweetness, the way it is felt, the way it is sensed, and the way it is part of a sociality, right? And what started off as a PhD project, I also did not know it would last a decade. But some of the questions remained unanswered when I finished my PhD in 2016. The initial fieldwork was between 2010 to 2012. And 2016, I was left with this question the same question that, what are the changes in production and the labor form that the sweet industry has experienced, particularly post partition and post 71 in the other side of Bengal, right? And it is very important as sociologists to break away from the boundaries of the nation state, also to kind of ask this question about shared geographies, I felt, because many lines can be drawn, but on embodied practices, how does it impact on embodied practices? How are borders lived through embodied practices? That is something, that stayed with me. Because when I used to do field work as well, when I used to go to the second site of, like in Krishnanagar, when I used to go down to that particular, to a particular sweet shop for everyday observations, and I write about this in the book, that the daily passengers in the train compartment, right, was to constantly tease me that why don't you board the Moitri Express, which used to pass by, at the same time when I used to take this particular train to Krishnanagar, that why don't you board this train, go to the other side, return and tell us which one's sweet tastes better. This, it may seem like, like everyday banter, But I thought there was a certain seriousness with which this reference to each other's food, right, both as a marker of the identity, but also as a acknowledgement that these borders have, something has shifted with these borders. I thought this was a gentle nudge also towards that. So the decade long interest stayed on with questions about caste, borders. Also, I think the sociality around sweetness and the meaning around sweetness really underwent a change. When I finished the fieldwork, particularly my PhD fieldwork, then the Cadbury sweets just became a rage, right? And I was very much interested. I did this paper where I got to realize that Cadbury had to launch this campaign in Eastern India because in Eastern India, sweets are an important item. And if you really look at the language of the fusion food, it's mostly it's mostly ingredients. Rarely will you find combination of ingredients. It's usually combination of cooking techniques, right? Or borrowed inspiration from cooking techniques. Here, a global ingredient is being introduced, but a local cooking technique is being retained. I thought that this is phenomenal, right? I mean, to tell something about the ways in which, there is a way in which the taste is getting changed, right, with chocolate, but chocolate is being marketed as a sugar substitute. And all of this ended up being a decade long journey.
Sorry, I was on mute for longer than I realized. Right, and you very well talk about your ethnography. So let me ask you a little bit more about, how you describe it as an ethnography of access, and what does access mean to you in the context of Bengali sweets?
So, So when we think about ethnography, particularly in today's time frame, I think for many of us who are researching our own society, it is also about, and I also talk about this a little bit in the book, that it is about studying sameness. And how do you study? And when you're studying sameness, there is a way in which some of the impressions, some of the stereotypes that are associated with societies also needs to get challenged, right? And one of the attempts, and this is where I think when I call it, sweet excess, excess is not excess is really to do with the materiality of the way in which sweetness is understood. So I opened the book with this vignette from the field work, where an interlocutor, a shopkeeper owner in Bangladesh, is telling me that Didi, when you buy sweets in West Bengal, you count the number of heads in the household and then you buy sweets. Here it is not quite the same. And I return back. My host family also kind of tells me that, oh, I can eat 1 kilogram of sweets by myself. It's immaterial to think, whether, and here was a cue that when you think about, when you really think about food and Bengal, the first thing you think about is famine, right? The second thing you think about is the food movements. And amidst food movements, Bengal famine, sweetness has survived somehow. Of, and here I asked myself a question that given the deprivation, given the scarcity of food, is it that people are taking pride in the quantum of sweets they are able to consume? I do not go into this thing of whether they actually are able to consume or not, but this pride that they take, that you have to show this much, right? This also is encapsulated with the way in which sweetness is a part of a sociality of our lives, right? I mean, you go anywhere across India, a pinch of sugar to the most fancy sweet will be offered along with a glass of water, right? So, how do you really understand this culture of sweetness where sweetness is intrinsic to social exchange? And this, I thought, cannot be framed either from scarcity or abundance. Because it's like I can consume 1.5 kilo of sweets is not abundance, because This is a way of understanding what food means or what this material means, right? This is a way of also understanding the material culture. At the same time, when we think about sweet excess, and why sweet excess, because sweet shops were actually considered culprits, of diverting milk supplies. Milk is an essential commodity. Sugar is an essential commodity. 1 liter of milk yields 250 grams of chana. So 750 grams of milk is somewhere not getting utilized. And it's on that account, and because both in West Bengal and in Bangladesh, milk supplies are organized around informal milk vendors, right? That the sweet shop owners are the first sort of customers of the milk supplies. And so therefore I cannot frame the existing sort of frameworks kind of around food, or single biographies of food usually frame it food from the perspective of essential, non-essential, scarcity, abundance, necessity, luxury. Somewhere these binaries don't work, I kind of realized, with sweets, particularly in the way in which the base material of sweet industry gets produced, the supply chain. The second, it is also to do with the fact that when it comes to excess, there is a way in which one needs to push the debates to how, despite deprivation, people still make room for celebration, right? So, and sweetness encapsulates that understanding of social, which has been there always in our social science literature, but somehow got overshrouded with these binaries of scarcity and abundance. And I thought it is important to nudge the debate towards excess, that even in societies where there is food scarcity, where there are food movements, food price movements, all of this, how do people make room for celebration? What are the sort of socio-cultural, economic, political registers through which they end up either negating celebration or accepting celebration as a part of their life? And I think depending on culture, there could be many food items, So probably in Bengal, I chose sweetness to study excess. In some other culture, it would be something radically different, right? So and also because of the variant of degrees of sweetness, and the like I said, from a pinch of sugar to the most expensive sweet. That is the frame that helped me to encapsulate excess.
So your book is also multi-sited ethnography because you dwell between West Bengal and Bangladesh. So how do you do that given the political and cultural sensitivities associated with both these regions?
The way in which, for me, and that's why I said it's very important to acknowledge how material cultures are spread across shared geographies. Then North Bengal only doesn't seem to be a one geography on the map of West Bengal, or one geography on the map of Bangladesh, because there are this interconnectedness as well, right? And if we think about, if you really think about the discontinuities, and and Ananya Janara Kabir has this beautiful this thing of the partial amnesia, right? If you really think about, borders, how they are lived in everyday life, right? At then you start thinking of the districts and divisions. So in Bangladesh, it is the division, and then within that there's a district, and within that jela, the Bangla word is jela, and then there's a sub district or upajela. This is the administrative division, right? In the case of India, we have the states, within that we have the districts, and within that we have the towns, panchayats, all of that, right? Now, when I started my fieldwork, and this is when I started my research on sweets, I was very clear that there's a lot of material ethnographic work available on Dhaka and Kolkata. And if I were to really study the production of sweetness, I was very conscious I want to move away from the center and study literally the districts, because each of the districts are known for famous sweets, right? However, when it comes, and that was a and they're also, this particular sweets are also associated with signature milk bases, right? So what I did was to, like, I thought that, because in the case of West Bengal, I have studied Nodia district and Hooghly district. Let me try and study the North Bengal from the side of Bangladesh. That's why Rajshahi division. Rajshahi division, interestingly, is also, the northern Bengal is also known in Bangladesh for, again, for periodic droughts, right? If it's a region that is known for periodic droughts, there are lots of this sarcasm, etc., that are targeted towards people of northern Bengal, to the people from, the northern part of Bangladesh. And I write about that in this piece called Bogura Doi. Now, if the northern Bengal is drought prone, how is it that cultures of sweetness and sweet shops have survived? Right? So for me, it was the northern Bengal from the side of Bangladesh. And then I started off with Hooghly because that's where the myths of the Chana are entangled. And I chose Nodia district because it will tell me an interesting story of, it will help us to understand the other milk bases, which are not so much synonymous. When we think about Bengali sweets, we only think about Chana. But Chana is not the only milk base. There are two other milk bases. One is kheer, thickened milk, and the second is shor, milk cream. And this milk cream is a stiff layer of milk cream. It's not a soft layer of milk cream. And these are specialized tasks. So I thought this would also allow us to engage with craftsmanship, artisanship, that is both related as well as central to understanding the landscape of sweetness.
Your book also sort of brings to attention the invisible bodies of the laboring people who are doing this work behind creating or crafting the mishti. So how does the artisanal pride coexist with the labor conditions in the industry, which could often be exploitative? Do you also see intersectionalities in terms of caste, religion, gender, etc.?
Rituparna, this is a very, very interesting question, because I thought doing fieldwork in sweet shops would mean easy access. And suddenly, because the sweet shop is out there on the street, right? I mean, it's public facing, right? So you would assume that no one will mind one anthropologist sitting with a notebook, diary, or without a notebook, or just hovering around, because there are chairs, there are tables, in the sweet shops. There were several sweet shops, and I don't want to name them, who refused access, right? And slowly, and I want to talk about, one sweet shop, the first sweet shop that gave me access, but also on certain conditions. The owner of that particular sweet shop said, Ishita, you have to realize you're a woman. Most of the sweet making happens in the night. We cannot allow you to work in the night. And that's when, I kind of also realized that you knew on paper that, many of the workers, much of the workers in the sweet shops are male. There are hardly any female workers in sweet shops across Bengal. There's only one, there is only one sort of confectioner I found in Bangladesh who makes the sweets. So in the classic sense, she was both an artisan and an artisan entrepreneur. Okay. But apart from Shubhadra Pal, I did not find anyone like her in the sweet shops, in small scale sweet shops. Of course, the managing director, at least when I had gained access to Kesitas Private Limited, the managing director was Manjulika Das. So it is not that sweet shops are not owned by female entrepreneurs, but largely it has remained, in the hands of male entrepreneurs, and this has and mostly male karigors. Now, when we think about the male karigors, what has clearly kind of appeared here is that the hierarchies that we see is, of course, the semantics. One is that in Bengal, there is particularly in West Bengal, karigar is seen as someone who has expertise. In Bangladesh, the word changes and they call ustad. That's the head karigar. It takes at least 10 to 15 years to become a head karigor or to become an ustad. In Bangladesh, I have really found, workers who have trained under the same ustad, like three workers or four workers in absolutely different sweet shops. All of them are telling me that they were trained by the same ustad, right? So, one of the things that is important to remember here is that the workers in the sweet shops are recruited through informal networks. And any recruitment that happens through informal networks across South Asia will have a reflection of the caste class ties, right? So, many of the workers who work in the sweet shops, either they are from the the caste groups that are either tied, that were traditionally tied with the agricultural activities or with milk and milk related or cow herding, right? So, in the book, I take you through biographies of the karigors because I don't want to generalize that, oh, today, the sweet shops are dominated by this caste group. Because there is a diversification of both karigari and ustad, this thing, but clearly, I have not found any non Hindu workers in the sweet shops of West Bengal except mechanized units. And similarly, in Bangladesh, repeatedly it was told to me that sweet making is your line of work. In this case, the your clearly meant implying my surname, which clearly is a Hindu surname, right? Um, so there are these constant references to caste, and lineage-based ties. Lineage-based ties are very evident in the naming of the sweet shops themselves. Like all the sweet shops, you will see either are named after very famous confectioners, or they take on the surname, the last name of the family name, right? Which also is both an indicator of caste. There are many sweet shops, particularly the well-known ones, which are the legendary Moiras. They take pride in the various ways to show sameness of lineage, right? So definitely, caste, religion, and gender hierarchies are very central to understanding the everyday life of a sweet shop.
So, what do you think has been the impact of modern processes like, food safety regulation, standardization, etc., on how sweets are made in these regions?
See, I think one of the impacts of standardization, or even before the impact of standardization, sweet shops increasingly became aware, particularly the sweet shops which have a larger setup, which have franchisees. They became aware that milk is bacteria prone. There has to be some checks and balances to uh, uh, have checks and balances, and therefore many of the sweet shops came up with their own sort of checks and balances. Either they would call it the hazard analysis critical control points. Many sweet shops prefer to take on this quality control measure, which means testing of the water to the testing of the final product, right? So in Kesidas Private Limited Bangalore, it was a beautiful experience of fieldwork, doing fieldwork in that quality control laboratory, where they ended up testing the quality of water, milk, to everything that was coming in and the final product. Now, one of the impacts of mechanization clearly has been that a lot of workers, a lot of quote unquote, this has also led to diversification of the people who can join the workforce, right? Because even if it is informal, I have found in KCDAS Private Limited, there was a worker who previously used to be a tailor, and then he joined this line of work, right? So clearly, you see, people who have been in various other jobs also take this up as one job, right? At the same time, despite mechanization, at least when I did my fieldwork in KCDAS Private Limited, Bangalore, they had two, three Bengali workers who would come on rotation for 6 months, and they would be in charge of a particular signature dish, the sandesh making, which would require a traditional, which really requires, even to this date, the making of the cooking paste is done by this long wooden ladle, which almost matches the height of a human, right? And it requires an expertise and control over that. The impact of standardization also has been that many of the sweet shops have to declare the expiry date now. So when you walk into a sweet shop, the expiry date is there. Also, the comment with which I open my book, that there you count the heads, and therefore you will see small boxes of, there are, in Calcutta, if you go Calcutta or neighboring districts or any district in West Bengal, you can even buy 2 pieces of sweets, right? But today's standardization really expects sweet shop owners to sell sweets by weight. So there's no harm if you want to sell 2 sweets, but you have to sell it by weight. There is this underlying pressure. So many of the sales personnel will tell you, but this is also the same price per weight, right? So which also kind of expects us now, if you do not now think about the political economy of this standardization. If I do not own the sweet shop and if I'm renting the premises, I will then start putting a caveat telling that minimum quantity of sweets you have to buy is 500 grams, which increases wastage. If someone were to walk in with 1 kilogram of sweets in my house, I wouldn't know how quickly to consume, right? So the idea of this, selling in small quantities and buying in small quantities was also a synergy of reducing waste as well, right? You buy so much that you can consume. But with standardization, particularly selling sweets by weight, right, I think will push also the consumer to buy more, not knowing whether the consumer is actually consuming it and not wasting it. I do not know that. Someone, this is also my nudge through your platform, that someone really needs to do a sort of a further, that whether this is leading to wastage as well, right? The third thing I think about standardization is clearly this rush of the communities of sweet shop owners to claim, geographical indication, which also kind of tells us about, like, if this is a local product, which has a very short shelf life, why do you want a geographical indication, right? And the chapter on geographical indication, I will really urge everyone to read it. It really talks about politics of authorship, because geographical indication is really about a place, but people almost take pride of it as if we are the authors, right? Uh, and if places have been, particularly this place, right, that I'm talking about, has been ruptured through, partition and all of it, right? How do you really understand a place without understanding people's movements that have made the place? So the chapter on GI is also a nudge towards that.
Ishita, can you also talk about how sweetness is being negotiated today, given the rising discourse on health and obesity?
One of the major changes that have come about with the sweet shops owner were pretty early on to catch this train, and they knew that they would be held responsible. So they started experimenting with sugar substitutes. And there is a range of Mishti sweets that is available, less sweet sweets that are available. only for only for people who are suffering. So anyone who walks into a sweet shop and asks for a mishti, and this has been a trend for quite some time. So what do? They basically use sugar substitutes, such as like exactly all the sugar substitutes that people end up using in their tea, coffee. And alongside, there is also, I mean, I have not come across, this is, I want to foreground, I have not come across sweet shops actually using monk fruit sweetener. So they will be using sorbitol, they might be using saccharin, but monk fruit sweetener has really hit the domestic sweet production, like for domestic purposes. But I have not seen sweet shops actually relying on monk fruit sweeteners. Um, Also, sweet shops also kind of, and there's a particular advertisement I came across which I want to mention, where this particular sweet shop advertised that diabetic patients should not eat sweets, right? And sweets need not necessarily lead to diabetes. Diabetic patients are encouraged not to consume sweets. So there is a way in which sweet shops owners have been aware of the risks and the health risks of sweetness. At the same time, many sweet shop owners, and I discussed this in the book, they are also telling me that just using sugar substitutes probably is not enough. But if sweet shops, or if there are steps or initiatives, to tell about the calorie count of a product, probably that will also kind of help to actually kind of gauge the nutrient value. The third, which I want to focus on, is, and this is also linked to larger processes of standardization, that many sweet shops today are supposed to sell sweets by weight, right? But actually, in particular in West Bengal, there is a long-standing tradition of even selling one piece of sweet, which means moderate consumption, right? Now, when someone, if the law is kind of telling you that you sell sweets by weight, and you will end up with arriving at a common denominator of weight, that you must take this minimum weight, right, of sweets, which ends up also producing excess of a different kind, and this excess would be definitely be wastage.
Right. Again, we are talking about insights emerging from ethnography, but your work also draws from archival material, cookbooks, caste association newsletters, and also, other kinds of observations. So, how do these archives expand your ethnographic work?
I think if we really take into account, like Sidney Mintz's work on sweetness and power, right? It is a great combination of, historical methods, right? And I really took inspiration from that, because without the debates that he shows us that are happening in the parliament, we will not be able to get the colonial expansion, right? So similarly, for me, the caste association newsletters was very much part of the ethnographic archive, right? And why so? Because by the time I'm entering the sweet shops, I'm seeing that the confectioner caste, the quote unquote confectioner caste group of West Bengal that was associated with with making of the sweets, they are mostly, if they have stayed in sweet making, they have transitioned to being the entrepreneurs of the sweet shops. So they are not the karigars, they are not the workers working, they have a tacit knowledge. How do I understand the history of this particular caste group? This is where the caste association newsletters really become useful, to tell me what were their traditional businesses, that the fact that they own sugar mills. And it also kind of tells me about the ways in which the diversification of sweet businesses have taken place, and the social stigma, all of it. So, caste association newsletters really become a very useful entry point to understand that what was the position of these caste groups right when India was becoming independent. And in post independent India, the Modak Association also made its claim. There was a huge sort of claim making within the Modak Association to be declared as other backward classes, right? So this also kind of tells us about how this pride that some of the people I'm encountering in the field, that, oh, we belong to this legendary confectioner. Was it? I mean, this caste association newsletters really help me not to generalize, right? Let me be very blunt here. At the same time, apart from the caste association newsletters, why cookbooks? Sweets are not only produced in sweet shops, they're also produced by homes. And in homes, sweet making remains mostly a woman's labor, right? No birthday is complete without making paish, the rice pudding, which is primarily made by the women. It could be women in the families, it could be domestic workers, right? So, why are cookbooks important? The early cookbooks, particularly by Vipradash Mukhopadhyay, as well as Mrs. J. Haldar, clearly tells about, the making of the sweets. It's seen like it's mirroring the sweet shops. But when we have women authors writing about sweet making, the repertoire expands to the repertoire also expands to, even they have recipes with cakes and puddings, but there are much more domesticated versions. There are those everyday uh, challenges probably women are facing in the kitchen, and they're addressing it. So there are recipes about cake, there are recipes about pudding, there are also recipes of various sweets, right? There are also recipes to do with tiffin. What sweets can you make for a child's tiffin? So it's, and you clearly see a gendered labor in the cookbooks, and in the writing of the recipes itself, you see that who could be the intended audience of this. So, and third, coming to the question of, how did the cookbooks, particularly also the caste association and the olfactory, how does it expand my ethnographic imagination? Initially, in my engagement with the olfactory was primarily to overcome the fact that I was not given access to field observations in the night, right? So when I used to enter the workshop in the morning, I used to take a sniff guess for myself and write it down that probably this sweet was made. That would be my opening conversation with the workers. Then I kind of realized that more so, when I did that artistic project on smells of Delhi, that my field diary of KC Das Private Limited or Shurja Modok, they had a distinct smell of the milk. Like it really smelled of, a very strong smell of milk was the residue. And I started thinking that if this is a sort of, when I returned back to the field, and particularly I think this is very useful in Bangladesh when I started my field work, I was like, how do you cope with the various smells in your everyday work lives? So the questions that I would ask initially in my initial days of fieldwork as a doctoral student was, how do you cope with the heat? But then I started asking, how do you cope with the smell? Right? So, and then, finally, when I returned back and forth to the field, the smell really became an analytic to understand the laboring body, right? That because in this line of work, nobody tastes as they go along. So they're training their eyes, they're training their nose, they're training their touch, right? And this synergy between these three senses is something that they hold with a lot of pride as their karigari, which they call andas. Many of the workers say, we have an andas, we have developed an andas. Now, when they're saying we have developed an andas, they really mean borrowing from Heather Paxson, they really mean that they have developed a synesthetic reason to understand and gaze if whatever part of the production that the produce is ready.
That's very, very interesting. And I also think it'll be very useful for young researchers, if they are listening, to navigate the field when there is, limited access, and what else can you do. These are all insights that emerge from, real field work and spending time on the field, and actually cannot be taught otherwise. Last question, Nishita. We have been talking about sweets and different dimensions, but there is also a lot that you write about the geographical indicator and, the battle that happened. So, how do you view this tension between geography, heritage, and then the process of commodification?
I really like this question, how you put it. How do you view the tension between geography, heritage, and commodification? And I think the answer really lies there because geographical indication is clearly to do with a place, right? But if you really look at like the law kind of tells you that, that like people who are applying, they can be the authorized user. And the certificate is valid for 10 years. After that, you have to renew. Now, the scholars who have worked on GI and probably who were resisting GI and later adopted GI, there was a shift, because it was thought that GI probably could be a way to recognize community rights, right? But who is this community of producers who are applying for GI? In the case of the GI applications of sweets, it could be a bureaucracy. It could be a food processing department of the government of West Bengal. Okay, so I have found food processing department to a collective of sweet shop owners coming together, converting it into a registered association, right? And there are also, select sweet shop owners who will come together from the same geography. Some sweet shop owners will be omitted, right? Or they refuse to be part of it, whatever. And that's why, in the for the chapter on GI, I actually, conducted surveys. Like all the authorized users in the GI application, I actually conducted survey which included them and some other sweet shops from the same place to ask this question: what is GI? Someone said it's a tag. Someone said, it is some, thing that the state is giving. So there was no clarity. What is GI? Even the people who had applied for it, right? Now, when we think about community rights, particularly in the case of sweets, ideally it should be a complex layered of community would be the karigar, the suppliers, the milk and the chana suppliers, because without that, the notion of terroir cannot be established, right? At the same, but how are they recognized? Apart from establishing the legal heritage of a place, their labor goes completely invisible when it comes to the authorized user. They are the benefactors, but they are the allied benefactors of this, but they are not the authorized user. Coming to the final this thing about commodification. In today's time, how do you really look at GI? How do you really understand GI and the politics of authorship? Because can anyone, including the audience, can they remember a name of any karigar across India? When they're buying a sweet, what do we remember? We remember the name of the shop, right? So, and it can, and it is to do with every food produce, you can take biryani also, and if it is like, for instance, tunde kebab, right? But the ways in which, so it's the name of the shop that we remember. So my question here is that, why or how do this naming of the shop really comes about, So on one hand, and therefore, I kind of, let me push the argument a little further. Even if the shop changes hands, if the name of the shop is there, the shop will continue to function. Nobody will be bothered because we are so used to the sign value, right? This is the final sort of commodification with material cultures that we are seeing. It's not only the use value and exchange, it's not only the unitary of use value and exchange value, but it is also the sign value.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ishita, for doing this conversation with us. And I think your book is a great reflection of not just the ethnographic works. I enjoyed it also for, your deliberations on biography and taking us through the journeys of the people involved in the making of the sweets. And it is a very telling commentary on the political economy of labor, space, etc. I think it reasserts the point that food is not just about, eating. It's much larger than that. So thank you once again, and we are also looking forward to your other works.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.